Hey everybody, I'm Jack Reed with Future Pastimes. I'm a designer on the expansions for the classic Dune board game, and I'm one of the designers on Dune Conquest, which is a streamlined version of the classic Dune board game. It plays much faster. It's for 2 to 4 players. There's a lot of similarities between them, but also quite a few differences, and it's really its own game. And in this video, I'm going to be comparing the Fremen faction in Dune Conquest with the Fremen faction in classic Dune. How are these factions similar? How are they different? And the whys and wherefores of that. So Dune Conquest, as I said, is streamlined. So the factions have fewer advantages. It really narrows it down what they can do. There's no advanced rules. It's just one rule set for Dune Conquest that is similar to basic Dune, at least in terms of the combat mechanisms. But there's a lot of other differences in there, like there's no single treachery deck. It's divided into a market deck and a battle deck. Battle cards you get for free, a hand of 4, and then market cards you buy for 2 spice each rather than bidding on them. So we wanted people to be able to get into action very quickly. There's more spice on the board to fight over. And that plays into some of these advantages. So let's first take a look at what the Fremen faction does, and then we'll compare it to the Dune Conquest version of it. So the Fremen in Classic Dune, they start with 10 of their forces on the board in up to 3 specific territories. So Siege Tabor, False Wall South, and False Wall West. And they can divide those up however they want. So they could put all 10 in one of them. They could put 3 here, 3 there, 4 there. That's totally up to them. They have a free revival of 3 forces, and in the normal rules, you can only revive up to 3 forces per turn. So the Fremen get theirs for free every turn. So in terms of the advantages, in the basic rule set, the Fremen have a few advantages. Their shipment action is it's free, it doesn't cost them any spice to ship, but they are limited. They have to place their forces from the reserves into the Great Flat or into any territory that's within 2 territories of the Great Flat, which is close to half of the board. Then their movement is they get to move 2 territories rather than 1, which is what the other factions are restricted to. Unless you start your movement in Carthag and Arakeen for any faction, including the Fremen, then you have a movement rate of 3 because of ornithopters. They have a Shai-Hulud advantage, and that is if the sandworm appears in a territory where they have forces, they are not devoured. And at the end of the nexus, they may move from that territory where the worm appeared with their forces to any territory that is not under storm or has an occupancy restriction. And then finally, in the basic rules, they have their special victory condition. So at the end of 10 turns of play, if nobody has won through stronghold victories and they meet certain conditions, then they win instead. And that is if no faction occupies Siege Tabor or Harbanya Siege, and none of the great houses, the Atreides, Harkonnen, Emperor, and Richess, if you have them in occupy Tuic Siege. And that Great House restriction doesn't apply to any of the houses like House Vernius, for instance, which is the Ixians. So that is what they can do in basic. Now, in advanced, they've got quite a few other things going on, so we'll take a look at those as well. They have the storm rule, so they get to see how far the storm is going to move because they have the storm deck. If additional sandworms show up in the same turn on the same spice blow, they can decide where those worms go. So they could wipe out other forces or the other spice on there, and they could potentially ride the worm if it appears in a territory where they have forces. They only lose half of their forces if they're caught in a storm, and they can ship at half of a loss into a territory under storm. They do not require spice to count at full strength because in advanced, you do have to pay your forces to count at full strength. And then they do have the 3 Fedaykin tokens, which are worth 2 each in battle. So quite a few things that the Fremen can do in Classic Dune. So not quite as many in Dune Conquest. We'll take a look. So they start with 5 forces on the board in the polar sink. And in Dune Conquest, they are the only faction that starts on the board. So all of the other factions have to ship down to get onto the planet. Their free revival is 2 forces, which is all of the factions in the base game are the 2-force revival. And they do have 3 advantages. So the Harkonnen only have 1 advantage, although it has a 2-part element to it. And the other factions have, in the base game, have 2 advantages. So the first one is called the Storm. When the Storm moves, their forces are not destroyed at all. So they're not taking half damage. They don't lose half their forces. They lose none of them in Dune Conquest. And keep in mind, everybody moves 3 territories, so there's no movement advantage for the Fremen per se. Their second one is a Spice Blow. So when a Sandworm is drawn during a Spice Blow, and Spice Blows in Dune Conquest always hit 2 territories. So you flip over 1 Spice card, and you're going to have 2 territories. So if you have a Sandworm, it shows up in both of those territories. So when a Sandworm is drawn during a Spice Blow, if they have forces in either or both of the territories that was on the last Spice card, those forces can ride the worm. Riding the worm is a little more of a constraint here. So they can move any or all of those forces to any other territory that is no more than 3 territories away. And however, any territories you pass through to the new territory must be sand. And the Sandworm does not ever enter sectors under storm. So it's a little bit more of a constraint. You're more likely to, because there's going to be a worm in 2 territories, you increase your chances of being able to get to ride a worm in at least one case. But there's only 5 turns in Dune Conquest. So you could play several games in a row where no worms are drawn. So it's kind of a rob Peter to pay Paul situation there. And then finally, their shipping and movement advantage is you may bring 5 forces into the polar sink from your reserves for free, and you may not pay to bring in any other forces. And then when you do move, you can move 2 groups of your forces, 3 territories, or 1 group up to 6. So they have a little bit of a constraint there. They can only ever bring in 5 forces each turn. So that's something that the Fremen have to deal with in Dune Conquest that they don't have to worry about so much in Classic Dune. You could bring all of your reserves in. So you start in Classic Dune with 10 Fremen on the board, and on turn 1, you could bring in the other 10. But it's made up a little bit by the fact that the Fremen in Dune Conquest do get 2 movements. So they start with their 5 in the polar sink. On that first turn of the game, they could bring in the other 5, and then they could move each of those stacks, presumably, to the 2 Spice Blows. It's from the polar sink, it's pretty easy to get to just about every Spice Blow on the board. So that's a big deal. So the Fremen are able to go after Spice. In the first 2 turns of the game, you can't win the game in Dune Conquest. So holding strongholds is not a big priority on turns 1 and 2, not until turn 3. So it really is the Spice that matters. So they're going to be able to have 5 forces in each, or they can divide that up. So they could say, look, I've brought in 5, add to the 5 already in the polar sink, and I'm going to take 6 forces and move them to this Spice Blow and move the other 4 to that one, or move 4 to a stronghold, or just leave them in the polar sink so that next turn when you bring in 5, you'll have 9 there, or however many you decide to leave behind. So you do have to think ahead a little bit about what you want to do with your forces. And depending on the turn order, you may want to aggressively go after the Spice, or you may want to wait to see what the other factions are doing. Turn order is a little different in Dune Conquest. It has nothing to do with the Storm. You're actually rolling a die, the Storm die, at the start of the game to determine who is the first player. And then that moves counterclockwise around. So if it's in a 4-player game and you're the first player on turn 1, you'll be the first player again when it comes back around. So you know ahead of time where you're going to be in the turn order from each turn to turn. So it's interesting, and it's a little bit of a different dynamic to the game. So yeah, I think in many ways the Fremen The Fremen in Dune Conquest, I think, are probably a little bit more powerful than Fremen in basic Dune. Advanced Dune, the Fremen are a lot more powerful, and that's largely because of the spice styling and the fact that they don't have to do it. They don't need spice for shipping. They can bring all of their reserves in. As I mentioned, they just need spice for treachery cards. So they get the 3 free revival. So spice is a little more important to the Fremen in this game. They'll need it for market cards. They can use it for revival because there's no revival limits. So they'll get the 2 out for free, but it costs 2 spice per force in addition to that. Again, and the trade-off there is if you're getting 2 for free and you can only ship 5 each turn, you only really need to have 3 more. So if you don't have that, all right, that's 6 spice to get up to your maximum shipment amount on there. So again, it's it's a little bit of good this way, bad that way, but it kind of evens out in. So I kind of enjoy the Fremen. They do pretty well. They tend to win a lot of the games. They overall still have the best leaders because they have they've got Stilgar, who's the highest, 7-6, 5 with Liet Kynes, and then a couple of 2s so that you can sacrifice a leader and not give your opponent very much spice for killing them in that case. So they've got that advantage going for them. It's a slight one, but can make a difference. And but in terms of winning, the Fremen stand a pretty good chance of winning through a military victory. And because they can go after 2 spice blows every turn pretty easily, if they're winning those combats and getting that spice, they stand a pretty good chance of getting an economic victory as well, which is what happens on turn 5. If nobody has 3 strongholds, it's whoever has the most spice, with occupying strongholds counting as spice for that victory. So those are your differences and similarities with those 2 versions of the Fremen. Let me know your thoughts. Do you have a preference of one over the other? Especially, let's say, if you only play basic Dune, do you think that the Dune Conquest Fremen are better than basic Dune for classic Dune, or is it about the same? I find it's fairly even. Dune Conquest kind of falls in between basic and advanced Fremen in classic Dune, but it's still a pretty competitive faction for Dune Conquest. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again.